In this presentation, we will talk about loneliness and how to connect when connection is difficult, which is especially relevant during the time in which this presentation was put together and when this recording was being done during social distancing from COVID-19. So over the course of this presentation, my goal is to help you understand or identify types of loneliness, understand the importance of social connection and the risks of experiencing loneliness, identify ways to socially engage during social distancing, and recognize signs of loneliness and identify ways to help others. So the current health crisis has left many of us in a sudden and unfamiliar state of isolation, to various degrees, of course. And before we talk about ways to stay connected during this time, when connection is certainly more difficult, I just want to talk a little bit more about why it's so important to recognize signs of loneliness and to promote social connectedness within ourselves and others. It's not just for happiness, it's actually very, very related to health. So first, let's talk about what loneliness really is. So loneliness is a feeling of longing and emptiness that is caused by a lack of emotional attachment and or social ties. The loneliness can be experienced by all people. In this case, we're talking, it is general, but also talking specific to older adults, as this is a population that has been hit pretty hard during these social distancing times with loneliness and social isolation. But loneliness is different than being alone. It's really about this lack of ties and lack of social connection. We, as humans, are social creatures, and our connection to others is what allows us to thrive and survive. So like I said, older adults may be more vulnerable to this experience right now, being more vulnerable to social isolation as a result, not only of social distancing orders, but also as a result of gradual loss of social roles that we've held onto as identities that change as we age, as well as the weakening of social relationships, which can make awareness of these signs critical for healthy aging. So loneliness doesn't always look the same, and there are a couple different types based on what the primary cause of loneliness is. Social loneliness is what occurs when we don't feel a sense of belonging to a group beyond ourselves. So somebody experiencing social loneliness might even feel social loneliness when they're with a romantic partner, even with a partner or a friend that you're close to. So if you don't have a wider circle of social support, you might feel that you and your partner don't have a group with whom you belong. Emotional loneliness, on the other hand, is something that arises from a feeling that you lack relationships or attachments. So you might feel this type of loneliness when everyone around you seems to have a romantic partner in your group, except you. So emotional loneliness can be felt when you need to talk to somebody about what's going on in your life, but you really just don't feel like there's anybody available to talk to. Existential loneliness, this last one we'll talk about within loneliness, is something that occurs on a deeper level. So it's really this experience of intolerable emptiness, sadness, and longing that results from the awareness of one's fundamental separateness as a human being. So it really is taking loneliness to an existential level. And although experiencing loneliness is different than being alone can also elicit feelings of loneliness. And social isolation has many causes and numerous defining characteristics. That's what this is describing here. Social isolation is this absence of supportive, significant others. And older adults are particularly susceptible because of environmental structures, loss of family or friends, or loss of the ability to perform certain activities that they once could. A person made to feel lonely through social exclusion or bereavement might feel threatened, anxious, or sad. Emotional states that promote attempts to reconnect for relief from this negative state of emotion. So as you are aware, more recently, social isolation orders have left many older adults suddenly and kind of abruptly without means for social connection. And this can be very, very distressing. It can go unnoticed for quite some time, which highlights the importance of why I want to put together this presentation. So unsurprisingly, loneliness is related to depression. A person who feels socially isolated may become depressed, and a person who is depressed may withdraw from friends, family, isolating themselves, and increasing their sense of loneliness. So it's a little bit of a vicious cycle here. Loneliness also impacts cognition, so our thinking, and has been shown in longitudinal studies to predict cognitive decline and risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. Additionally, loneliness impacts health. And studies have shown that loneliness can predict poor health outcomes in the older adult population. So having a pre-existing illness or physical health condition, when adding loneliness to or social isolation specifically to the mix, can actually exacerbate these pre-existing conditions. That includes cardiovascular disease, and even things like cancer and inflammatory diseases. It actually alters the cells in our immune systems. One study reported that an activation in the region of the brain called the ventral striatum was inversely related to reported levels of loneliness. And so within this area of the brain, the ventral striatum, there's actually a smaller region that's involved in reward processing or motivation building. So the authors of this study hypothesized that loneliness might reflect some form of dysfunction in social reward processing. So something here is just imbalanced, or it's not acting or functioning in the way that we'd expect it to. And then trait loneliness, which would be describing a longer term feeling, being a trait, has shown to be associated with elevated levels of cortisol, which is a stress chemical in the brain. And so chronic social stress related to loneliness acts as a trigger for the release of certain chemicals, which can activate changes in our immune and inflammatory response systems. You can see there's an actual biological reactions happening and taking place in our brains when we experience loneliness, especially for prolonged times. So our brains process loneliness as a threat to our survival. And this chronic activation of survival response promotes most chronic diseases of aging, including type 2 diabetes, dementia, and other forms of cognitive impairment. And loneliness can impact mental health, as well as depressive symptoms and subjective well-being. And part of the goal of this presentation is to convey the importance of recognizing loneliness, because it can have a very big and significant impact on our health. So independent of objective features of social relationships, which are things like one's living arrangement, the number or frequency of contacting people, as well as the presence of caregivers. So independent of those things, loneliness is related to impaired daily functioning, reduced physical activity, which in itself is associated with a number of health concerns, less overall well-being, and as I discussed just a second ago, a number of physical health problems like sleep disorders, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, various mental health or emotional problems, even substance misuse. Additionally, beyond being related to these more severe problems, loneliness has shown to be prospectively predict increased depressive symptoms, impaired thinking, and multiple disease outcomes. So that means that on top of being related to problems concurrently, loneliness can actually set somebody up for problems that will show up later in life. And unfortunately, loneliness also tends to be associated with poorer health outcomes like alcohol use and smoking. Poorer health practices like alcohol use and smoking, and fewer health promoting behaviors like less physical activity and poorer nutrition, specifically among older adults. Social connection, though, really shows the opposite outcome of loneliness. But briefly, people who are more socially engaged tend to have better physical and mental health outcomes. So specifically within older adults, we see in studies that the rate of cognitive decline will drop by an average of 70%. So again, among older adults who are socially active frequently compared to older adults who are not. And older adults who take part in social activities on a daily or weekly basis, just engaging in social activities regularly and consistently, have a 40% less chance of developing dementia. So it's crucial that we can identify signs of loneliness and intervene to encourage social activity and social engagement in other people as well as in ourselves. But that's easier said than done. So things that we can do. First is identify the extent to which you or a loved one might feel lonely or socially isolated. So things like, am I feeling left out? Or my relationship supportive? Just really critically thinking about that. And then consider what underlies any of the problems. So why don't you get together with your friends? And have you lost touch with people that you used to speak with regularly? Think about the most appropriate strategies you can take, making sure to recognize any obstacles or barriers that might get in the way of taking effective action. And don't be afraid to ask for support. In fact, it's encouraged to ask for support when you need it. In general, there are some common suggestions for staying socially engaged, like things like joining a club, volunteering, or taking classes. However, it is certainly a little bit more challenging right now, as we're all home for the most part, if not entirely. And we recognize the new and significant obstacles to finding social connection. So even though it's difficult, I'd still encourage you to try to make the effort to connect with others, as well as encouraging others to do the same. So some suggestions to remotely engage with other people in a positive and healthy way include things like a virtual hobby club of sorts. So plan, for example, a video chat with a group of close friends to discuss a book, so like a virtual book club, or create something, doing an art project, or trying a new recipe together. You could also do volunteering in different capacities, so doing check-in calls on local seniors or vulnerable populations, people you know who might be isolated, or foster a pet while animal shelters are struggling. Don't underestimate the power of pet companionship as well. Another idea might be to write letters to friends or family, or set up a pen pal relationship in your community. Some other things would be to join a virtual exercise group, inviting your friends to join from their homes as well. Exercise is a great way to naturally elevate our levels of mood-boosting hormones in the brain. We already know that. And that can also help combat the effects of loneliness that you might be experiencing. There's also virtual support groups to consider joining. Many of the in-person support groups that existed have turned to virtual options, as well as new ones are forming. So receiving support and encouragement from others who might be sharing or experiencing similar feelings can help ease the symptoms of chronic loneliness. And staying connected doesn't have to look all that different than it did before the current social distancing orders were set. It could also just be focusing on spending quality time with the people that you are living with and seeing regularly. Spending quality time with your partner, loved ones, children, or roommates, or whoever you're spending time with. Spending quality, focused, undistracted time. So again, it is very important to be able to recognize symptoms or signs of loneliness in ourselves as well as in others. So some of the common signs of loneliness to be on the lookout for are things like an inability to connect with others on a deeper, more intimate level. The engagement is very surface level. Not having close or best friends, maybe having friends, but more casual or acquaintances that you just don't really feel like there's anybody who truly gets you, or seeing that in another person. An overwhelming feeling of isolation, regardless of where you are, regardless of who's around. Negative feelings of self-doubt or self-worth. Or trying to reach out, trying to connect, but it's not being reciprocated. So really just not being seen, not being heard. And then also feeling exhausted or starting to burn out when you do try to engage socially. So where to find help? Because our research initiative is located in Hillsboro, which is in Oregon, I've included a number of Oregon resources that are specific for older adults who are feeling lonely. But there's also a number of national numbers to call. So if you are feeling lonely, or you know somebody else who's feeling lonely and you're just not really sure what to do, you need some more resources, consider calling any one of these numbers. There's also a number of virtual or online resources to consider. So specific for COVID-19 is this virtual companion site with virtual social visits, even things like grocery runs or tech support. There's also Well Connected, and the AARP's Connect to Affect, both of which are geared towards older adults who can reach out for social support or friendly conversation, education, activities, things like that. Okay, so that was finding connection when connection is difficult, so a little bit more on loneliness. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or you'd like a copy of the slides. Here are some of the resources that we use to put together this presentation, all of which are recommended. Thank you.